Hi everyone, I'm Jo Fry and this is my channel Jojo Fry Rocks, and this is the third episode in my Death of Rock mini-series and the final episode to wrap everything up. And in this episode I'm going to look at the period from the period of the 2000s really. As I said in the first episode, I think we have to accept that in 2024, rock as a mainstream genre of music is dead and has been for at least the last decade or more. And we're going to look today at that kind of period from the 2000s where the last few nails really went into that coffin. And I'm going to start by talking about a topic that hasn't really come up so much in the last couple of episodes. But this is where it really starts to become important. The era of kind of the late 90s, early 2000s, which was a period of massive technological and societal change, really, which had major implications and major changes for the music industry. And those changes really seem to affect rock much more adversely than they did some other genres of music, pop, hip hop, those kinds of things, which are still alive and still thriving today. So I'm going to kind of look at some of the reasons for that, or reasons why I think that's the case. I'm going to be drawing on some ideas and themes and concepts from some other YouTube videos that I've been watching, a few from Finn McKenty, the Punk Rock MBA channel. So I'm going to put the links in the description so that you can go and watch the videos that I'm talking about, because they are really interesting, I think, from the perspective of trying to pick apart sort of why this has happened to rock in particular and why it hasn't necessarily happened to other types of music. So, obviously these changes affected the entire music industry. So from kind of the late 90s onwards, what you see is sort of the gradual disintegration of the kind of monolithic global culture that we had really in all things, from films to to music and other things, but music in particular, because before the internet, in a kind of pre-internet era, really we had TV and we had MTV, which was kind of the pinnacle of this sort of global monolithic culture. So we had radio as well, which was always hugely important, particularly to rock music. Airplay and radio stations was how your record got out there, and the charts were hugely important, and that was all kind of to do with radio airplay playlists. So the Billboard Top 100, all those kinds of things, massively important. You had record companies, the sort of whole infrastructure behind the music industry, labels who decided which bands to give record deals to, which albums and singles to promote, which bands to kind of put their money behind. And you had, of course, record stores, record shops, which sold the physical formats, the physical media of CDs by that time anyway. Previously vinyl, cassettes. So this was kind of like what we had before the internet came along. And I think prior to that, it had really been a case of a lot of the time record labels, record stores, radio stations and MTV sort of making decisions really about what to make popular, what to champion, what to get behind and push in terms of kind of sales and selling that to us as consumers. And so really kind of music consumption pre the late 90s had been quite, not a passive thing, because obviously people made their own choices about what genres and artists they wanted to listen to and what records they wanted to buy, gigs they wanted to go and see, etc. But like you didn't have much of an individual choice. You didn't have much individual control over, whether or not you would like every song on an album, let's say. So you would buy an album, and a lot of the time there may be 3 or 4 songs, there'd be a hit single or a couple of hit singles on there, and a few other good songs, and there would be a few songs that you might skip or that weren't as good as the rest, that had kind of been used to fill up space on that album. Not all the time and not every band, but it happens. We all know it does. And so, you just kind of had to accept that. And when you handed over your kind of £15 for an album, for a CD, in the early 90s, you sort of took a chance because you hadn't necessarily heard all of that music before. There wouldn't be whole albums played on the radio. So, you were kind of stuck with, I suppose, whatever the record label wanted to put out and whatever record stores wanted to sell you. That was kind of revolutionised, really, by file sharing. So obviously everyone knows Napster, the most kind of famous example of where this started, where you could sort of download and share files of individual songs, kind of peer to peer. And where that started to kind of become a mainstream way of consuming music was really when Apple invented the iPod. So for the first time, you could completely legally and legitimately just buy and listen to single tracks for, I think it was like 99 cents in the beginning or something. I had an iPod. I remember getting an iPod, but I was quite late to the iPod party. But yeah, I up until then I'd still been listening to CDs. So, still buying physical media. But, a lot of people got in quite early on that game. And I remember iPod being, the iPod Shuffle being this really, really cool, interesting new thing. And I remember speaking to people and kind of saying, well, what is it? Like, is it just like having a Walkman? Like, I've got a Walkman. Why do I want one of these? Like, I can already, skip through tracks on a CD or whatever. And they were like, no, you don't understand. You can create playlists. You can choose any song at all that's ever been written. You have access to a library of all music, and you can just buy and download and create your playlist of any songs from any artist from any period in time. And I remember when I first got my iPod and I kind of loaded all of my CD collection onto it, and then would do things like would just, shuffle, like, so it would just randomly play any song from any of my CDs. What a kind of mind-blowing experience that really was. And then it had this like function, this genius function, where it would kind of sort a lot of your music into genres, and create playlists of those genres. And that to me was, I just didn't know what to think of it. It was a completely new experience of listening to music, and songs would crop up from albums that I've forgotten that I had, that I would never have kind of necessarily listened to. They'd just sat there on my shelf of CDs, and I may have just left it there forever. And I would kind of listen to these playlists that were sort of auto-generated, of my own music collection, and I just used to really love that. I'd go on long journeys, on bus journeys or train journeys, or just walking to work and back, and it really kind of changed that whole experience for me, and really kind of added a lot of value, I think, to the way that I was using my music collection, the way that I was listening to music. So I kind of remember how that felt at the time. But what I hadn't thought about was, and what obviously someone like Lars Ulrich from Metallica did think about, was the kind of impact that was going to have on music, on bands, on artists, on the sales of particularly albums, and what that might mean for sort of the relative cultural importance of putting out albums. So I think that was kind of, well, that was really it. That was really the death of the album, in terms of, there was no need anymore. There was just absolutely no need, really, for any band to put together a collection of songs, when you could just release singles. And then the whole economy behind that had completely changed anyway. And the whole way that bands and artists made money and revenue from sales was no longer going to be from selling albums anymore. And therefore record companies were not going to produce those anymore. And I know they still do, and they still did back then. But it was clear from that time that was going to have an impact in terms of the music consumption, and then therefore music production. And I think that's one of the things that has impacted rock as a genre more negatively, perhaps, than other types of music. Because in some ways, perhaps pop music has always been a little bit more disposable. Pop has, just by its very nature, has always been centred around the single. That's the important key medium in pop music. It's about having a number one single. It always has been. The whole point of it being popular, it's to kind of have that level of popularity that really, really only singles can kind of attract. And a lot of pop stars, you know, yeah, sure, they made albums, and they made some great albums. And like, okay, you can look at Michael Jackson, and Thriller is like still one of the greatest albums of all time. Sure, it is. But, you know, I wonder how many people can name, I don't know, 3 or 4 of the tracks from Thriller. You know, unless they are a kind of hardcore fan. I don't think that many people could. Whereas, you know, a lot of people could name 3, 4, 5, 6 Michael Jackson singles, you know, hit singles. So I think the way that pop works has always been based more off of singles, really. You know, if you think about any of the biggest pop stars, you know, Madonna and all the pop stars nowadays, they are all about the singles, sales of singles. But of course they would be, because that's where this was going and has been going for at least the last 20 years. Yeah, but for rock, it's not the same. And yeah, you know, conversely, sure, rock bands have hit singles all the time. Smells Like Teen Spirit, massive hit single. You know, any Bon Jovi hit single, they had loads and loads, from Living on a Prayer, You Give Love a Bad Name, you know, you name it, in the 80s. But actually, it was album sales that propelled rock bands to the heights of stardom. You know, it's a whole different proposition with a rock band. Fans of rock music, they really want to sit and listen to a full-length album. It all kind of runs quite a lot deeper, and in order to be able to get into it, you really need more than just one song from a band. You know, you really need that collection. You know, it's very difficult to explain. I realise now, I start trying to explain it. And I think it's probably worth doing a whole separate video, actually, about albums and how they came to prominence and why they're so important, or have been, particularly in rock music. But, you know, if you think about particularly prog rock, for example, and sort of concept albums where you may only have like 4 tracks, like 2 tracks per side on a double album, but each of those tracks is sort of like 30 minutes or something. You need kind of much more than that 3-minute single allows to sort of get across the ideas, the themes, the concepts, you know, the emotions, the you know, the experimentation as well of where you want to go musically. All of that, you know, is not something that really just translates to a song. So I think that's one of the reasons why this particular trend and change in the music industry really negatively impacted on rock as a genre. So then you kind of have the fact that, given that you can now, from the early 2000s onwards, you're now able to access all of music, like the entire catalogue of every band and every song that's ever been written, which is a double-edged sword. It's kind of great in a way, for listeners, for us as consumers, because we have access to all of that. Whereas, when I was growing up, what music did I really have access to? Quite a lot of music, really. Obviously, as we said, there was radio, there was television, so you would see quite a lot of different things and hear them on the radio. But it was really like a curated selection of stuff, as I've said, which had kind of more or less been through several gatekeepers before it was presented to you as a consumer. There would have been my parents' record collection, and that was kind of, really great, but a mixed bag as well. And so, I would have been listening to some older stuff, the Beatles, Elvis, ABBA, the Beach Boys, kind of things that my parents' generation had grown up with. But not everything, they didn't have every record that ever been put out. So again, that was kind of a curated selection of their favourite things and things that they'd bought over the years. And, then when I was kind of listening to music with my friends and at school, and when I started buying like cassettes and CDs, I really, my basis for comparison, I guess, was really whatever was around at the time and being played on the radio, so whatever was deemed as kind of like popular at the time. And then, the things that my parents had listened to and that I would listen to occasionally as I was growing up. But I wasn't listening to that all the time. So let's say, when Nirvana came along, I wasn't sort of constantly listening to playlists that had some Nirvana songs and some Beatles songs and comparing the two mentally and kind of making judgments and decisions about, is this as good as this? I wasn't even kind of listening to Nirvana and Def Leppard at the same time. I kind of went through months or years of kind of listening to a band as they'd come into my life or as they'd become popular. So I guess what I'm saying is that it's very difficult nowadays because new bands or any band that has come along, certainly in the last sort of 10 or 20 years, has to literally compete with all of the greatest rock bands that have ever existed. And that is a lot of pressure that I think bands, particularly rock bands in the past, just didn't really have. I don't think they really felt that. I don't think that like Bon Jovi felt that they had to be as good as or better than Led Zeppelin. There was, I think, there was much more of a sense of music belonging to periods of time. And as much as they paid homage to those artists and bands that had gone before them, so Richie Sambora is a massive fan of Eric Clapton, like everybody is except me. But I don't think they were thinking that the fans that they were playing to would be comparing them to Cream. So, you know, he'd grown up listening to that, but he kind of associated that with, you know, his generation and older, and they were making music for a younger generation who hadn't necessarily heard that, or if they had heard it, they didn't necessarily care about it. So I think there was just a lot less competition, actually. And so bands were kind of freer to experiment, I think. But also I think it was easier in the past for them to build a fan base and become popular without living in the shadow of everything that has gone before them. You know, it was like every time a new band formed, it was a new slate, it was a clean slate. So I think sort of that's one of the other things that makes it very, very, very difficult, particularly for rock bands who, you know, in the last sort of decade or 20 years have come along, because they're obviously gonna suffer in comparison to all of the greatest bands of all time. The other thing to say about that is about the attention economy. And, you know, arguably I don't really take that into account in my videos. They're incredibly long. And I'm really, really grateful, by the way, to everyone who does watch them and who does follow me through these kind of trains of thought. But I am aware, as anyone who's got any involvement with YouTube or social media or anything nowadays, that, you know, we live in an attention economy. And there are something like 60 million songs on Spotify. You know, how is anyone meant to process that? Like, how are you meant to find new music that you like and that you're going to connect with? And I think, again, particularly with rock music, it's not really as formulaic as pop. So for pop artists, to some extent, there are sort of templates. You know, there are drum loops, there are like chord progressions, and, you know, typical lyrical themes and melodies that you can reasonably easily construct, even though it sometimes seems to take about 15 songwriters to write one of these things, like for Sabrina Carpenter or someone like that. But, you know, you can churn out a great deal of this stuff, I think, and just kind of take that scattergun approach. And some of it will become popular, and people will stream it and it will get onto playlists and stuff. For rock music, it isn't that easy. It's not easy to produce. And that kind of brings us on to another thing. So in terms of music production, since I think, you know, the mid to late 90s, at least, you know, people have been able to make music more or less in their bedroom, on laptops, you know, using samples, using music software, drum loops, you know, synthesizers. I mean, people have been using synthesizers since the 1970s, but in terms of a single person creating music by themselves, with, you know, a kind of full band sound, as it were. You know, that's been possible for really quite a long time. Versus, you know, rock music, which is actually quite difficult to record. If you have sort of a live band with live drums, you know, a bass player, one or two guitarists and a vocalist, I mean, you know, amping, miking, it's all an art in itself, just the actual sort of logistics of recording rock music. And so, you know, for music companies, music sort of record labels, music production, it's very, very expensive. You know, studio time, engineers, producers, all the equipment, it's just horrendously expensive. And we can all kind of think of examples of rock albums that have just cost, you know, phenomenal amounts to make. And at a time when record labels are kind of losing a lot of money on sales because of the new and different kind of model of music consumption, you know, people are not going out and buying these physical formats anymore. So how are they supposed to then fund the making of an album of rock music that is incredibly costly, incredibly time consuming, and can't just be sort of churned out as I think quite a lot of pop music can be, particularly if it's done by a solo artist. And, you know, what do we find now in 2024? The biggest selling artists in the world are solo artists. You know, it's no great surprise. And that's a particular problem in the genre of rock, because rock music is made by bands. And so sort of all of this is really going against kind of keeping this type and this style of music alive, and this particular format that's made by bands. It's just not kind of viable in a lot of ways in today's world, unfortunately. And so those are some of the reasons that I think the particular kind of way things have gone in terms of technology and in terms of the music industry, or kind of the collapse, really, of the traditional music industry, that has affected rock music on many levels, and in a way that is quite different from other artists in other genres. But having said all that, I think there are lots of things about rock and about the music itself and about some of the bands that we've had kind of in the last 20 years or so that, you know, they've either not helped themselves or they just haven't been very good. Rock as a genre has not engaged really with kind of new forms of music production, new technology. You know, there hasn't been that kind of engagement with it, which is odd because they kind of did in like the late 1960s and through the 1970s, when prog rock, progressive rock music was huge. It was absolutely huge. It was thriving. You know, bands like the Beatles in the beginning, in the late 60s, were really breaking new ground with like embracing new technology in music and new, like even coming up with kind of new methods of recording and producing music, things that had never been done before, and really kind of pushing the limits and pushing the boundaries of, you know, of what was possible. Whereas that just hasn't happened in, you know, the early 2000s up to today. And in fact, there's almost kind of been like a reactionary movement, as it were. You see sort of bands pushing back against things like digital modelling amps, for example. And it's all kind of like everything has to be analogue. No, we love tube amps. You know, like some of the oldest like amplification technology that's been around since kind of the 1950s. You know, or trying to recreate stuff that sounds like that. And that, like, to me, seems quite regressive. It is certainly very conservative and quite reactionary, which, again, to me, sort of goes against the ethos of rock music as a kind of, you know, rebellion and energy and kind of freshness. Like, that just isn't there, you know. So kind of that refusal to innovate and engage with that, I think, is again another one of the reasons why rock is dead and has died. And on another level, there is a refusal to sort of engage with the technology around like self-promotion and social media. You know, it's not really a problem for kind of hip hop artists, pop artists, and, you know, just other genres really. They're all over Instagram. They're all over TikTok. You know, there's kind of no problem with it. And rock bands, you know, they still seem to think that if they play, you know, if they go out and they play live, play some clubs, play some shows, maybe play some festivals, develop a little bit of a following, you know, make an EP, go to a studio, send out demos, that is what is going to make them successful and popular. And, you know, and that's how they're going to get a record deal. And that's like based on stuff that used to happen. That used to be the way it was. It hasn't been that way for at least the last 20 years. It hasn't been that way for a really long time. You know, since kind of the early 2000s, we've had things like MySpace, for example, which is where, you know, pop artists like Justin Bieber started out on MySpace. Like, pop artists knew that this was the next big thing, and they jumped on it. And they jumped on YouTube when it first came out, you know, and Instagram and TikTok. And rock bands, I think, didn't take advantage of any of that. So when I think about, you know, one particular rock band who I really love, and as you all know, they're one of my favourite bands of all time, The Darkness. You know, they had their breakthrough hit kind of in 2003. Now, they did that in the traditional way. You know, they had been playing live since around 98 or 99, I think. They'd been playing the sort of Camden pub circuit. They had a few gigs around the country, and you know, they persisted in sending demos and things, and eventually got a record deal. But by then, you know, there really wasn't the infrastructure there in the industry. And they were not, like, they didn't have a social media presence at all. So I remember they had a website, and that was really only for kind of selling t-shirts and stuff. They'd put a few announcements about dates, tour dates and things. But what they had on there were forums. I don't know if anyone remembers forums. But before we had kind of Facebook and WhatsApp and all these other things that we have today, YouTube, if you wanted to talk to and connect with other people that liked the same kind of things that you like, particularly music-wise, you know, you would go on a band's website or something like that, or the website of the NME, you know, music magazine or something, and you'd go on the forums and you'd create your username and everything, and you would chat to other people and put comments and things. You start threads about particular topics that were of interest. But, you know, they didn't engage with it. The Darkness themselves, or whoever was kind of running their website, you know, they didn't go on there. They didn't engage. Like, even with those kind of early things, you know, they didn't kind of use those to leverage their popularity. I think they still thought that it could all be done in that sort of traditional way. And I suppose they just really caught the tail end of it. But it was all kind of going into this death spiral by then, really. And sort of by the time their particular little bubble burst, a couple of years later, so by 2006, like 3 years later, that was all gone. That was all gone. So, you know, I think without having like laid the foundations early on in terms of kind of having an internet presence, having a social media presence, I think that when they finally did regroup and come back kind of around 2012, they found themselves in a really difficult position. They were so far behind where everyone else was at that time, that it was kind of unrecoverable, really. So, you know, and I think that rock bands in particular have taken quite a long time to catch on to where everyone else was kind of 20 years ago with the social media game. So again, that's one of the reasons why we are where we are. And I think, you know, it is kind of broadly too late for them to really do anything about that now. So that's kind of, I think all the reasons why rock has been particularly affected by societal and technological change. But I think there's a whole other kind of level to why the music isn't actually as popular, or why the music isn't popular, because actually it is. Like the heritage, I hate calling it that. You know, the older bands are still playing. They're still selling out stadiums worldwide. you know, Def Leppard still selling out huge stadiums and stuff. So it's not that the music itself isn't popular, but there are no modern, new rock bands that are really, really huge or hugely popular or that are ever going to be. And I think there are kind of two more reasons for this. And one is that rock ran out of ideas. It ran out of steam. Okay, so this is an idea that I've borrowed from Finn McKenty, the punk rock NBA channel. And it's kind of an axis, which creates kind of this matrix, this sort of 4-box matrix diagram. So you have a kind of line down the middle, which kind of goes top to bottom. At the top, you have things that are formally interesting. So in terms of like the form of the music, you know, how they're made, how they're written, how they are created, produced, how they sound, things that are interesting from that perspective. And at the bottom, formally boring, so things which are the opposite of that, not very good, not very well played, don't sound great. That's kind of dissected horizontally by an axis that goes from conceptually boring, so things that don't really have any big ideas behind them or any kind of real meaning, to conceptually interesting on the other side. And really, you know, something like prog rock, for example, would be kind of in the upper right quadrant, where it's both formally interesting and conceptually interesting, because those musicians are very, very skilled and talented most of the time. You know, they're musicians who have kind of mastery of their instruments, they're virtuoso players, so the form of the music is exceptionally well made, and the ideas, the concept behind it are interesting, are different, are pushing boundaries kind of in both directions. So, you know, and most of rock music, from sort of the 1960s and absolutely into the 70s, was really kind of in that quadrant, even if it wasn't necessarily prog. But, you know, the Beach Boys, Pet Sounds would be in that upper right quadrant, I would say. There are plenty of examples of music from the 60s and 70s. Bowie, for example, would be in that quadrant. So conversely, where rock has got to, unfortunately, it's drifted towards kind of the lower left quadrant now, which is kind of both formally and conceptually uninteresting. So it's not only kind of not particularly brilliantly made, you know, it's not using the best kind of technology and things that music production can offer nowadays, but it's also kind of run out of ideas. This is his point, really, is that sometime around sort of the late 90s, early 2000s, rock really ran out of ideas. And you could kind of see it going that way. So in the upper left quadrant, you have things which are kind of well constructed and well produced and well played, that sound pretty good, but don't have any real new ideas or deep meaning to them. And I would kind of say, I would kind of put hair metal like in that category, really. They weren't kind of edgy at all, or, you know, those bands were not sort of coming out with anything new conceptually in rock. But there was that element of, you know, virtuosity, particularly with guitarists. You know, that was the era of the guitar virtuoso. But as I've kind of been talking about really in this series, it's sort of leading to the beginning of the end for rock music, because there were no real kind of new ideas there. Whereas kind of in that lower right quadrant, so something that's kind of conceptually very interesting, but, you know, arguably not kind of formally very well done, even though I would argue that it is in a way. But Finn McKenty argues that like Nirvana is the example of that, where it's kind of the ideas that are important and the concepts behind it that are important. And I also think that the music is exceptionally good as well. But I kind of get where he's coming from, and I think it makes sense, like, within this argument. So basically, yeah, after that time, rock has now ended up in the quadrant where it's run out of ideas, both in terms of kind of the actual form and style of the music. There's nothing new there, and there are no new ideas there either. So in terms of kind of using this matrix approach to describe what happened to rock in the early 2000s, or, you know, 2000 to 2010, possibly, I would say that just a lot of the bands that were around at that time or became popular at that time were, you know, they were either kind of in the conceptually boring and maybe quite well, you know, maybe relatively talented, but certainly conceptually boring, or they were just not very talented, not very good in terms of the playing, the singing, the writing, and they didn't really have anything to say. and I think, like, these bands really were all the nails in the coffin of rock music. And I came across an absolutely brilliant video that really, really captures this very, very well. It's a guy called Rob V, and his channel's called Rob's Rave, and I'll put the link to his video in the description. But, you know, he talks about kind of 4 genres in particular, and those are pop punk, emo, indie, and what he calls butt rock. And like, that's not really a genre that I'm terribly familiar with, but I am certainly familiar with pop punk and with emo. I remember those especially well from the early 2000s. And these are, you know, these are all things that I tried to get into, you know, because they were guitar-based, guitar-driven bands. You know, I thought things like My Chemical Romance were, you know, that album, The Black Parade, I thought that was at least kind of conceptually interesting. I mean, it was a concept album. they reinvented the band as this kind of otherworldly, spooky kind of incarnation of themselves. And they had this whole sort of concept around, you know, the vision of kind of what happens before you die, and it was all kind of quite dark. And I thought, oh, you know, this is maybe all right. And it's produced by Roy Thomas Baker, who's produced some Queen albums, produced the second Darkness album, Green Day as well, I think. So, you know, I thought, oh, this is probably going to be quite good. On the basis of the single, Welcome to the Black Parade, I bought that album. I was very disappointed. It was absolute tosh. And in the words of Rob from Rob's Rave, it was garbage. And this is, you know, he gives so many other examples of these bands, but Foo Fighters, like, I've said this before on this channel, and I will say it again, boring, you know, just boring. There's just nothing behind the music, they've got nothing to say, and the music itself is pretty boring as well. Like, it's competent, he's a competent singer, he's a much better drummer than he is a guitarist or singer. So, you know, that's the Foo Fighters for you. But yeah, Green Day, I mean, their early stuff is okay, but by the 2000s, Rob in his video talks about American Idiot, and I would have to agree with him. That album is garbage. Sorry, don't like it at all. Yeah, bands like the White Stripes, the Killers, you know, these are all kind of bands that came out in the early 2000s. They were huge at festivals. Like, I remember going to the Reading Festival, I think it was 2004, because the Darkness were headlining, so obviously I was there, Reading and Leeds, and I got my spot right at the very front. You know, I elbowed my way past 100,000 people so that I could be at the front to see the Darkness. The Darkness didn't come on until like 10 o'clock in the evening or something. And I had to sit through a number of these bands, the Killers, like the Hives, Arcade Fire, flipping, you know, there were several. Snow Patrol, I think, Kings of Leon, and my God, I just don't think I've ever been so bored in my entire life. I mean, that is probably one of the longest days of my life. And yeah, I mean, none of these bands were any good. Like, they might have a catchy song here and there, but really, do I want to listen to a whole set of them? No, I do not, because they haven't got anything interesting to say, and their playing isn't even especially good, and neither is their singing. Yeah, I mean, he's got a few kind of new metal bands on here, which, you know, I think is a little bit unfair, and he does actually kind of say, he gives a few of them a pass, really, because I think he likes them as well. So like kind of Linkin Park, you know, he's got Evanescence on here. I think the new metal stuff, firstly, it's not rock, so I think I would give all of that a pass anyway, because it's not included in this genre, right? It's metal, and if anything, it's a fusion of hip-hop, rap, hip-hop, and metal. It's not really rock music, so it's a subgenre of metal, so I don't kind of really include it. Although Finn McKenty includes it, and because his video is about how rock and metal ran out of ideas, but he puts new metal in the sort of formally interesting, conceptually boring category. So if I was going to critique it, I guess I'd say the same thing. I guess I'd say that explains to me anyway why so many guitarists, friends of mine, really like Limp Bizkit, because they like Wes Borland. You know, they like the technical aspects of the playing. They like his guitar playing, that's totally understandable. That's completely fair. He is great. And I think that also explains why I would say I don't like Limp Bizkit, because I think they're conceptually boring. I don't think Fred Durst has got anything to say of any interest to anyone. So yeah, that's kind of where I would put some of these bands that Rob mentions in his video. He also gives Incubus a pass, and I would as well, because I think they kind of were slightly different. I think musically, especially, having a guitarist in there like Mike Einziger, who I think is one of the most underrated guitarists in any band that I can think of. He is so good, technically, musically. I think he's just on another level, and I actually think as a singer, as a vocalist, Brandon Boyd is actually really good as well. And okay, they may not be doing anything that is conceptually any different from, let's say, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, for example, but I think they are kind of, they're not as in your face, they're a bit more chilled, they're a bit kind of, there's something a bit deeper about their lyrics and about their songs that I think elevate them slightly. So it's not just that kind of superficial formulaic stuff. I think they're a bit like behind their time in a way. Like if they'd have come out earlier in the 90s, I think they'd have been more part of that kind of alt rock scene, rather than being kind of lumped in with new metal. That's always been a bit strange to me. But yeah, all the other bands on here, more or less, Panic at the Disco, oh my god, Snow Patrol, I might have already said them, Maroon 5, that just doesn't even count as rock to me. Sure, they're not rock, are they? Nickelback, yeah, what can you say? I mean, I'm not going to say anything that hasn't already been said about Nickelback. Whereas actually Rob is a lot more generous. He sort of says, well, it wasn't all Nickelback's fault. They cop a lot of the hate for sort of the post-grunge, early 2000s, diabolically crap music scene. But actually they were probably better than some of these other bands that they are sort of copping the flack for, I think. So I don't know, maybe he is right. Maybe he's right about some of these. But yeah, almost all of them that he mentions are pretty bad. And of course, there's Coldplay as well. And I think I'm just going to kind of wrap up on that point, really. What did they come out, like 2008 or something? I'm not going to look it up. I can't bring myself to search for Coldplay and have that in my search history. But yeah, to me, like that's where it ends. That's where it ended. Okay, Coldplay came out calling themselves a rock band. yeah, okay, to start off with, they were, guitar, bass, drums, and a vocalist. But it wasn't rock. Like, I wouldn't call that rock music. To me, like, I don't think it's formally or conceptually interesting. And yet by 2008, that was winning, that was kind of winning, I don't know, Grammys, Brit Awards, you name it, from 2003, when The Darkness had been kind of best newcomer and best album and everything at the Brits for rock. In those 5 years, we'd gone from that to Coldplay, and really that was the end of it. There hasn't been anything significant in terms of rock music or new rock bands that has come out since then. Sure, there have been a few bands that I've liked. Florence and the Machine, kind of the year after that, 2009, but that's kind of pretty much folk pop, really. And I can't really think of anything, honestly, since then that has appealed to me in terms of it having anything to do with rock music. So yeah, I think those are kind of some of the factors behind why rock music died and when it died and how it died. And as much as we can blame it on kind of changes in technology, changes in the music industry, I think at the end of the day, we have to face up to the fact that it ran out of ideas, it ran out of steam, and by the mid-2000s, it just pretty much ceased to exist. And, I'd say that that's a pretty bad thing, because of course I would, because it's my favourite genre of music. So I think that's a sad thing. I think it's a bad thing overall, but lots of other people have said that, well, this happens eventually to everything, everything changes, everything moves on, and it's had its time, and it had a really good run, and it's not like that music isn't around anymore. Of course it is. As we keep saying, it's available for anyone to listen to at any time that they want to. Everyone can access the whole entire back catalogue of every rock song from the 1950s, onwards. So there is that. A lot of these bands are still playing, and you still can go and see them. And I'm still discovering new rock music that I like. Like I discovered Richie Kotzen quite recently, and I went to see him play, and it was amazing. And so, there are still things that that you can access and that you can do, and you can discover. So it's not all bad, but at the same time, I do think that even other genres like pop music are really, really, really missing that key influence that rock music used to have, both in terms of its like energy, attitude, and the sort of conceptual basis of it, as well as the kind of technical basis of it. There is no kind of virtuosity in popular music anymore, and the people who are skilled, if you like, are the songwriters, if you can call them that, and the producers. Really, it's a producer's world now. So that's kind of, to me, that's a bad thing overall. And I think the death of rock has made all of us and all of music all the poorer for not being around anymore. But anyway, let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to know kind of what your thoughts are. Do you agree with some of these things, you know, or do you have an alternative theory? Do you have an alternative position? Do you think it was something else? Is it not all Coldplay's fault? Although don't stick up for Coldplay, because I'm not going to talk to you ever again. So anyway, if you've stuck with it through all 3 episodes, well done. And thanks a lot for your time and for listening. And yeah, take care. All right. Thanks, everyone.